Hello, my name is Katie and I'm a diabetes dietitian, and through a series of videos I aim to show you how to calculate the carbohydrates in the foods that you eat. This will help you to manage your diabetes, improve your blood glucose levels and hopefully build flexibility with what you eat and when you eat. So in this video, let's take a look at some handy measures for fruit, for potatoes, how to make your own handy measures for food such as rice and also chips, bread and also cereals. Firstly, let's take a look at fruit. A handy measure for fruit could be a tennis ball. If the fruit is around the size of a tennis ball, like this orange, we could estimate that there are around 10 grams of carbohydrates in it. This may, however, differ for smaller fruits such as grapes. As you can see, this apple is a lot larger than the tennis ball, so we may estimate that this is around 1.5 tennis balls, so around 15 grams of carbohydrates would be in this apple. Now let's take a look at potatoes. A potato, about the size of an egg, contains 10 grams of carbohydrates. 1 scoop of mashed potato also contains around 10 grams of carbohydrates. 3 chunky chips also contain around 10 grams of carbohydrates. If they were thinner chips, around 4 of those chips would contain 10 grams of carbohydrates. So if I had 3 scoops of mashed potato, that would equal 30 grams of carbohydrates. Similarly, if I had 15 chunky chips, that would equal 50 grams of carbohydrates. So now let's make our own handy measure for rice. Here's what you will need: a calculator, a notepad and pen, some scales, ideally digital scales if you have them, a plate, the food we want to eat, and a handy measure like a spoon. So now let's make a handy measure for rice. We can use anything we want to make a handy measure: a bowl, some spoons, a measuring cup, an ice cream scoop. But for now, let's use a spoon. So now I'm going to work out the carbohydrates in a spoonful of rice. And that means the next time I eat rice, I only need to use this spoon to work out how many carbohydrates are in my serving. In this calculation, we need 2 bits of information from a carbohydrate reference: the carbohydrates in reference and the weight of the serving. I'm going to use the reference guide to get that information. So after looking in the reference guide, I can see that there are 29.4 grams of carbohydrates in 100 grams of cooked basmati rice. So now we need to weigh our serving before using the calculation. So now let's weigh our serving. To do this, we need to turn on the scales. We then need to place our plate on the scales. We then need to select 0 or tare. And now the scales will read 0. So now let's weigh my rice. So the weight of my rice is 70 grams. Now let's do the calculation using the reference guide. So if we turn to the rice, pasta and noodle section in the reference guide, we can see that there are 29.4 grams of carbohydrates in 100 grams of cooked basmati rice. So now let's do the maths. The calculation is carbohydrates in reference food divided by weight of reference food times by the weight of my serving. So that is 29.4 divided by 100 times by 70, which gives me 20.6 grams of carbohydrates in my serving of rice. So we now know that my spoonful of rice contains 20.6 grams of carbohydrates. So if I have 2 spoonfuls of rice, I know that there are 41 grams of carbohydrates on my plate. So the next time I have rice, I only need to use this spoon to calculate the carbohydrates on my plate. Now let's create a handy measure for cereal. Here is my usual serving of cereal. Firstly, I would follow the same steps as I did with the rice. I would weigh the cereal using some scales, and I would then look up the carbohydrates using a reference guide. I have already done this, and in my portion there are 30 grams of carbohydrates. I'm now going to use a jar to record this. So if I pour my cereal into the jar, I can then draw a line, the name of the cereal and 30 grams of carbohydrates. And next time I come to use this cereal, I can just pour the cereal to the marked point. You could also use a marker to write down other cereals as well. Similarly, we could also use something like a cup. I know that my serving of cornflakes reaches just the top of this cup. And that is 30 grams of carbohydrates. Finally, another handy measure could be used when assessing the thickness of bread. I know that in a thick slice of bread, there are 20 grams of carbohydrates, whereas in a medium sliced bread, there are only 15 grams of carbohydrates. Similarly, in a very thin slice of bread, there would only be 10 grams of carbohydrates. So in this video, we have looked at handy measures for carbohydrates, which will hopefully save you time the next time you eat that food. Why don't you create your own handy measure?